Ladies and gentlemen, we now proceed to the first plenary of this conference on societal implications. I would like to invite the panelists on the stage, please. Mr. David Battisti on climate science, food systems, Professor of Atmospheric Sciences at the University of Washington. Ms. Vidhya Venugopal on health. She's the country director NIHR EC-NCD. Ms. Reema Nanavaty on labor. She's the director SEWA, Self-Employed Women's Association on India. Mr. Biraj Patnaik on vulnerable communities in India. He's the executive director, National Foundation for India. He was formerly the principal advisor to the commissioners of the Indian Supreme Court in the right to food case for close to a decade. Mr. Rahul Mehrotra on habitat and built environment. He's a professor of urban design and planning, Harvard Graduate School of Design. And this session will be moderated by Professor Satchit Balsari. He's an associate professor in emergency medicine at Harvard Medical School and in global health and population at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. The Balsari Lab studies the impacts of public health emergencies, disasters, and war on vulnerable populations. His team collaborates with populations in distress, humanitarian response agencies, civil society organizations, governments, and international agencies to reduce information asymmetries that threaten to exclude the poor and disadvantaged from decisions that impact their lives. He is the youngest recipient of the Dr. B.C. Roy Award presented by the President of India. I hand it over to you now, Professor Balsari, to lead us to this lovely session.
Thank you, Lipika. Thanks for that generous introduction, which my team must have provided to you. Appreciate it. Congratulations to all of you for really being committed to climate change, for sitting through 10 speeches preceding this. But as you know, in India, we love to break records. So here we have 10 speeches before the first plenary, and you've done it. We honor the time commitments that are allocated to us, and we'll keep these remarks brief. The idea of this plenary is to give you a flavor of what will come over the next 4 days. To give you a sense of the interdisciplinarity of the conversations that will occur. I wanted to very quickly introduce folks as I go along, so I won't read out all the intros right away. As a physician, I understand that heat impacts the human body through a myriad ways, through acute heat illnesses, through heat strokes, also through slow chronic ways, right? You get kidney disease, it impacts your cardiovascular system, which means your heart. But it also does so in very corrosive, subtle ways. It impacts sleep, it causes restlessness, it causes fatigue, irritation, lack of concentration, lack of productivity. Those of us that have grown up in India have experienced this to some extent, at least once in our life, if not every summer. And we have a sense of how terrible heat feels. Before the impact of this heat is captured in our data streams and morbidity and mortality, there is this band, this zone of misery that we all experience when you cannot possibly think that human life is flourishing or that it is a life of dignity. What I would like to do here with my colleagues here is understand these various pathways in which heat affects the life of the residents of India, not just through these direct impacts in heat, but through how heat will mediate all aspects of life: shelter, cities, work, agriculture, commerce, and so on. This conversation, capturing the societal implications of what the changing climate will bring to bear, encourages participants in our 4 workshops over the next 4 days to center human life and human dignity in their deliberations. My first question is directed to Reema Nanavaty. Reema is the executive director at the Self-Employed Women's Association that needs no introduction. She has been at the forefront of organizing women workers in the informal economy for over 3 decades. 90% of India's labor force, as we all know, is in the informal sector. As executive director of SEWA, she oversees the development of 3.2 million member trade union focused on economic empowerment. Her work has earned her international recognition, including a seat at the World Bank's Advisory Council on Gender and India's Padma Shri Award in 2013. Reema, namaste. All of us present on the dais here, of all of us, you are most closely associated with communities most at risk from the impacts of the changing climate, and heat in particular. You represent an organization of women workers that are home-based artisans, street vendors, farmers, salt pan workers, construction workers, working indoors, working outdoors. Few technological fixes are currently available that can protect them from extreme heat. While we understand that heat impacts the human body, how is extreme heat manifesting in the lives of the workers in India today? And what are organizations like SEWA doing about it? I would expect that a response to a question like this would take several hours, but we have 4 minutes.
Namaste. I will draw from the experience of SEWA's Swachh Akash, as we call, which is the Building Cleaner Skies campaign that was launched on SEWA's 50th year in 2022 and is now run by and for SEWA's 3.2 million members across almost 20 states in India. And I would like to offer several points, but the first and the foremost is that what is really important is that when women are leaders in the process of climate and well-being of women and mitigation, I think when we talk about responses to extreme heat by the citizens of India, both urban and rural, all poor working women in the informal sector of India play a major role when we talk about heat or cooling. I can give some very concrete examples, and since I have only 4 minutes to give these examples, I think what I would really like to emphasize here is how heat snatches away the dignity and the self-respect of the poor women workers in the informal sector. Because we heard about science all through, but science also has to look at this aspect as well. And when there are extreme heat events or shocks, women and their families are not able to go to work, even if they have support income sources such as cattle or livestock. That also the income drains out. And women are compelled to go back to the traditional sources of money lenders. And these money lenders start lending at not only exploitative rates of interest, but they also ask for sexual favors. And these things never come out when we talk about heat stress. And this, when you have a woman who has to, go through these things in front of her children, in front of her husband, it's an assassination of a person. It's an assassination of a woman worker. And that is where I think two things which have really helped address this, and that's the parametric heat insurance product that we've been now, this is the third year, where we have 500,000 women who will be enrolling. And not just that this is subsidized entirely or somebody's paying for it, the women are paying for it, almost 50% of the premium. And I'm very grateful to the Climate Resilience for All, the CRA, the Ashrock, the Rockefeller, everybody. But I also want to say that, what has really helped us in fine-tuning the heat insurance product is the sensor study that we are also doing together with the I may be pronouncing the name wrongly, but the Lakshmi Mittal family, South Asia Institute, but in short, Satchit and his team. And I think what helps us is that how do you really fine-tune the parametric heat insurance product? And when do you set your triggers? What kind of wraparound services are needed? And how do you then work on accelerating the adaptation efforts by the women? I would also like to talk about the green villages that we are doing in partnership with the National Rural Defense Council here as well, and how that helps the efforts in cooling. How can the families move to greener homes and to greener indoor cooking methods as well, and how does that lead to lessening the heat inside the homes. And we apply the same to the cattle sheds as well, that how do you make the cattle sheds also cleaner and greener. 4 minutes are over, and I would end here abruptly, but whoever is interested, I would be happy to share more in detail. Thank you.
Finished a few seconds before time, which will return to you in round two. Dr. Vidhya Venugopal is next. She's an occupational hygienist and climate change scientist specializing in the intersection of heat, workload, and worker health. As a country director of the NIHR, SRIHER, in public health, we love acronyms, Global Healthcare Research Center, she leads research focused on improving health outcomes for marginalized communities. With a background in environmental chemistry and global research experience, she's been a strong advocate for the occupational health of female workers in developing nations. Dr. Venugopal, your research has for long shed light on the impact of heat on the lived experiences of communities at home and work. How would you take the many challenges that individuals face that Reema Ben outlined to shape future policy? What solutions are begging to be tested? What solutions are begging to be scaled?
Thanks, Satchit, for this opportunity, and thanks, Reema Ben, for all these nice points you gave. Having worked in the space of individual exposure, heat exposure, and health outcomes, I will come from that angle. There are a few things that can be done when it comes to exposure reduction. You reduce the exposure, your outcomes are going to be much better. So when you're speaking about exposure, who needs to be given more importance, or for whom do we have to make sure that exposures are reduced? So Satchit was telling, I was very keen about marginalized communities, which is in a way true, but I am also very interested in vulnerable communities, which includes workers, migrant workers, informal laborers. I come mostly from an occupational background because their heat exposures are the highest when it compares to all the others. Of course, there are elderly workers, elderly people with comorbidities who might have higher exposures and even less exposures but bad outcomes. But those workers who form the foundation of the country's economy are the exposed the most. So when we're speaking about this, what are we going to do about it, and how do we categorize them? Who needs more care? The heat vulnerability index, just for communities and workers, is something that one has to be looking at. When you speak about heat vulnerability index, it's just not one number about the temperature that the person is exposed to, but about what space that person is in. Is the individual exposed to lack of toilets at workplace? When Reema Ben was speaking about sexual favors and other things, I was internally thinking that woman loses her dignity in a workspace where there is no toilets for her. So she either drinks less and eats less so that she can wait till she goes home. So that's something that we see in our research every day when I work with workers. So that's one thing. Other thing is, many of these migrant people, when they go back to their temporary sheds, which corrugated steel or something with absolutely no cooling facilities, how do we even consider them? So that heat vulnerability index might help us categorize and prioritize resources, that whatever resources is available, either by the company, either by CSR or by the government of India, how can we try and categorize these resources so that these people who need the most are given something? And the third thing that I would try to say is, we do have adaptation measures in place. India has heat adaptation measures. Heat action plans are there. How do we actually contextualize it for the setting? For example, Rajasthan Heat Action Plan is for rural settings, is really good example. Ahmedabad Heat Action Plan for urban settings, workers is really good. We can learn lessons, to take lessons from that, and then kind of roll it out in other, and whatever challenges we have had, whatever that can be used as opportunities in other regions. So reinventing the wheel for every single city, state, and rural area is like wasting our time. Another important thing is, how do you even prepare these people? What did we do during COVID to conquer COVID. Risk communication. Risk communication is one area that we think we should be focusing on. When we say heat warnings or heat alerts, when do we send it? Do we send it on the morning when the heat wave is going to happen so that the agriculturists can stop going to work? Or do we prepare them few days earlier? So all these things are like something that can try and reduce exposures. And advocacy, telling only about problems. Communication should be also giving some solutions. Can we do the do's and don'ts? Like how can you protect yourself? And Dr. Tarun Khanna and others very clearly said about the traditional practices that have been used through all the ages before, but now all of this is forgotten. And then now we are in a new space and world where, heat is actually directly hitting us. So I will stop here and then maybe let others take questions. Thank you.
Public health professionals love statistics. Statistically, both women on the panel so far in the last 3 hours have finished their talks at 100% on time allocated to them. Biraj Patnaik is a human rights advocate with extensive experience in food security, public health, and governance. Before leading the National Foundation for India, he served as South Asia Director at Amnesty International and was a key advisor in India's landmark Right to Food case. A co-founder of the Mitanan Community Health Worker Program, he has played a critical role in expanding access to healthcare and social rights across the country. Biraj is Director of the National Foundation of India. NFI and Biraj have been extraordinarily generous in supporting our plan on the ground. Thank you, Biraj. Biraj, you worked in individual and institutional capacity with marginalized communities, especially tribal communities. What are the opportunities you see to ensure just transitions? What do these idioms mean in the Indian context? What's working, and where do we go from here?
Thank you, Satchit. Hello. Thank you, Satchit, and thank you to the Mittal Institute for organizing this. It's a great privilege to be part of these proceedings. Let me just draw a concrete example to share why I feel that the mitigation adaptation measures we take should not repeat the mistakes of the past. Now, if you look at conservation as a success story, India has had an extraordinary success story in conservation, in wildlife protection, through the 80s until now. But if you look at the impact it had on the marginalized communities, the forest dwellers, the Adivasis, the indigenous communities in India, they bore the brunt of this conservation success. Instead of going and learning from the people who protected those forests for millennia, we dispossessed them, we displaced them. So the brunt of adaptation and mitigation is likely, if you're not careful, to be borne by those who are most impacted by it. And who's most impacted by heat waves? The street vendor, the person living in a rural context, people without access to cooling solutions. In other words, the Dalit, the Adivasi, the ethnic religious minorities, the people really, the 90% of the informal sector, the people, the Swiggy driver. And we can't offer them gratuitous solutions of staying at home in an air-conditioned room. It's not possible. And one of the things that President Garba mentioned in his speech was the Garmi video that we had worked with Howard on. And what we really liked working in that project with the Mittal Institute was the fact that we were not basing our public communication on things that are not possible for someone who's poor, but much rather on what is practicable. Now, if we move this to the climate space, so if you take, say, solar farms, right, as a measure, where are these solar farms going to come up? They are being set up by industry on lands which government classifies as wastelands, or which have been acquired for this purpose. But there is not a single square inch of land in this country that is a wasteland. Every single inch of land is used. The communities may not own those lands, but they have usufructus rights. They have, the land is used. Maybe there's one shrine that has cultural religious significance that they use. Maybe that land provides access to more productive areas that they go to work to. Now, are we going to see a double whammy yet again, where we have a situation where the people who are worst impacted by the climate crisis are going to pay the price for the mitigation and adaptation measures that governments will take. And I think we are at the cusp of a great opportunity because we have lessons to learn from the past that we don't need to go back to again. So let me end here and answer the next set of questions.
Thank you, Biraj, and thank you for the three of you for providing sort of the lived reality of how this is going to manifest. This brings me to Professor David Battisti. Professor Battisti is a Tamaki Endowed Chair at the University of Washington and leading global expert in atmospheric sciences. His research focuses on how interactions between the ocean, land, atmosphere, and sea ice drive climate variability over months to decades. A fellow of the American Geophysical Union and American Academy of Arts and Sciences, he also explores the impacts of climate change on global food security. Just in response to what folks just said, David, with business as usual, and that certainly seems to be the more likely scenario than not. Having first heard from Professor Schrag and now from our colleagues here, what will 2047 look like?
Is this on? Yes? Yeah. Maybe pick up where Dan left off and maybe go into a few more things in detail. If you think about the warming over the next 20 years in India, it's pretty much assured that the amount of warming over the next 20 years is going to be more than twice of what it was the last 20 years. And that's not controversial, and it's independent of any kind of emission scenario. If you think about the warming of the next 20 years, and you put it in the context of the birth of India, independence 2047, it's going to be more in the next 20 years than it was since 1947. Those things are pretty much assured, and you can start thinking about what the impacts would be on that warming is unequally distributed across India. Some places warm more than others. It's unequally distributed in the seasonal cycle. The warming during the monsoon season is much less than during the pre and post monsoon seasons, which isn't necessarily good, given the heat stress is not in those seasons, in the monsoon season. And if you think about what this means for food security, grain production goes down with increasing temperature under otherwise idealized conditions, plenty of water, plenty of nutrients. And the measurements, it's typically 10% reduction is what you can expect over the next 20 years, all else being the same. And it varies a lot, crops. I think wheat is an important crop for India. Right before this meeting, I thought it's time for me to call my friends at CIMMYT. Is there anything new in terms of breeding for heat stress? And the answer is there's new things, but the new things aren't good news in the sense that it's very difficult to and it's not reasonable to expect new varieties to actually withstand heat stress any more than the current varieties. So that's a problem. It's a big problem. Another problem from food perspective from India that is seems like it's unavoidable unless you adapt, right? Is milk production. I mean, heat stress on dairies, on cows and buffalo is going to be high. Milk is a really important source of protein in India. And so those things are sort of unavoidable. They're there. There's going to be changes in the precipitation too. We're going to talk about those in the next few days. I won't go into them now because we're kind of focused on heat stress, and there's good reason to be. But the other aspect, of course, is human health. And I think Dan put out some numbers that come from a recent study that said like a 20% increase in kind of dangerous heat over the last 20 years. If you look at the projections of heat stress today, like how many people or how many days per year is the heat index, combination of temperature and humidity, such that it's dangerous to be outside, where it really inhibits your work and it hurts your health. The typical number now in India, I mean, it depends a lot on where you are and what kind of work you do, but for sort of modest labor is on the order of a month, a year. And if you look at just 20 years out, if we're looking at 2047, you're looking at 4 months per year. It's a fourfold increase, is probably a pretty reasonable number. And so those are things I think are really serious issues that I hope we spend the next few days trying to figure out how we construct policies and mechanisms for dealing with these increasing stresses.
David, thank you for those sobering thoughts. The theme here, as we all see, is that the problem is interdisciplinary, and the need to talk across our various silos is really important. One of the recurrent themes that comes up that you've heard over the last couple of days at the NRDC conference and at the National Adaptation Program is also this question of shelter, right? Heat is so tightly related to shelter, not just for humans, but also for animals, as you point out. We've talked a little bit about sort of the impact that this has on rural communities. I want to draw this back to the cities of India, and I have a question for Professor Mehrotra. Rahul Mehrotra is an architect, urbanist, and educator whose work spans architecture, conservation, and urban planning. As professor at Harvard GSD and founder of RMA Architects, he has led projects ranging from historic restoration to social housing. His research on India's urban dynamics, including the concept of the kinetic city, continues to shape global conversations on design and development. I must confess that I feel a little bit like Eklavya. I'm not enrolled in any of Rahul's classes. I would never qualify to be a student at GSD, but I try, cheat and listen to as many Rahul Mehrotra lectures that I can. And he's greatly influenced how many of us in public health think about the interaction between health and space. Rahul, another concept that you've often talked about that has captured my imagination is this concept of impatient capital, where you have argued that capital can often be readily poured into architectural forms that can be realized rapidly. That results in large infrastructural projects and often housing for the wealthy. You raised these challenges a long time ago. Now here we are, looking at what our cities have morphed into, that simultaneously provide economic, social, and cultural opportunities for millions, and yet they threaten, in myriad ways, the health and well-being of our populations. With the changing climate, how should we be thinking about the urban form in India?
Well, again, one can spend an hour like you almost allowed Reema Ben to do. But I just want to start by saying, just listening to you all, I couldn't but help think that space matters, right? And I think finally all these issues play out in space. And I think where we have to change the conversation is we are reactive. I mean, planning in the last 3 decades in India, especially in the urban areas, has been reactive. It's not avant-garde, but it's reactive. And so we are what I call the post-planning phase in our history. How do we change that and simultaneously look at short-term measures? I mean, getting the cow sheds fixed, getting reflective roofs. These are short-term measures which we have to take care of. But finally, we have to begin to spend more time speculating about how urban form itself could address these issues, right? Because it's really the urban form. So what do I mean by that? And your question to impatient capital, I wish the government leadership was here, because the one word government should take out of its jargon in urban planning is monetizing land, right? That's become the bane of our cities. And that's what I mean by this sort of drive, the tyranny of images. Bombay wants to be like Dubai, and Dubai has wanted to be like Shanghai, and it keeps going on till the little village near Nasik wants to be like Nasik, which is wanted to be like Mumbai. It's the tyranny of images. And cities have become places where we now welcome and facilitate the arrival of capital and let it realize its values. In autocracies like Dubai and Shanghai, that's happened. It creates very brittle form. If you think about it, a good city, any city that we enjoy and that we admire, 90% of its form is housing. And housing is fabric, which is background architecture. And you have 10% of the city, which is foreground architecture, a church, a temple, an institutional building. What's happening in our cities today is everything wants to be foreground architecture. So they become autonomous objects, which then we cannot respond to appropriately in terms of climate. Form follows function was the dictum of the 60s and 70s. And in the early 70s, Charles Correa, our own Indian architect, challenged this in the global conversation about architecture, and he said form follows climate, not function. And that really is something we need to go back to, because the moment you can create housing as urban form, as fabric, you can go back to the courtyard house, you can go back to houses that share walls, that insulate each other. You break away from the autonomy of this object, which is then, then what happens is you build the dumb glass box, and then you put a chemical or mechanical fix, double insulated glass, sealants, better air conditioning, to get a certificate for being a green building. And so this sort of paradigm has to change. And I think while we look at strategies in the short term, we really have to have a serious conversation about how we reimagine urban form. And that will be the only way that I think we'll be able to mitigate and meet the challenges. And that's why, the stepped wells have been alluded to. This is truly the case where a building is a machine that functions, but it's also culturally, socially, climatically responsive. And that's why that's a wonderful emblem to hold up. But I think it's this fundamental we need to go back to, and I hope we can carry that conversation out in the next few days.
Thank you, all of you, for those really insightful remarks, which truly set the stage for the four workshops. I want to end with a second round, now 3 minutes each, and because I know you can do it. Your imagination of 2057, right? What does then the climate resilient 2047 look like to? How do we get to your vision? David, may I start with you, because you alluded to what is going to happen. What might the appropriate response then be?
Yeah, I think at some level there's a research program that is an interdisciplinary one, which is saying like, well, how do you design an or urban environment so that the heat stress is low in the environment? How do you in that process you could do that by combining some basic atmospheric sciences with some in urban planning, urban design, and say like how do you set up this situation so it reduces extreme heats in parts of the environment, and you can combine that with a traditional weather forecast of 5 days in advance to kind of give some real good warning about what will happen locally. So that's one thing you could do. But I think this idea of kind of re-envisioning the urban environment is going to be really critical to withstanding heat, given that so many people live in an urban environment. Obviously, there's going to be real issues with agricultural workers too, as well. And there's, I'm sure, a different set of solutions, but they all involve, I think, how you design housing at one level. How you do planning to withstand these heats. And obviously, on our end, we have to understand like a little bit better the climate science, but not so much. It's really how the climate science or how the meteorology interacts with the urban environment and the farming environment.
Thank you. And I just wanted to respond to both what Rahul and you said. And we need to take this imagination to sort of its logical endpoint. There's a lot of excitement around cooling centers, for example, right? But if you think through what that means, your work isn't portable. Right. So you can't just extricate yourself from your work environment and go cool off in a cooling center. As much as we think that, the lives of the poor are dispensable and they have that time to sort of do so. And so what does it therefore mean to have a cooling center where you can continue to work, where you can continue to bring your work that's portable, etc. So these are hard challenges, and these are conversations in the right directions. And Rahul, like you said, they're on two time scales. But Vidhya, over to you.
As you rightly pointed out, many people do not have the luxury of going to the cooling centers. One, they would be antagonizing their supervisors. Second thing, they would be losing their wages, and their livelihoods are based on those wages that they work in heat. So, few things that can be done is like what SEWA has been able to do for the women workers. Yes, it's very nice for gender specific and all of that, but we are talking about an India where, like, both men and women work. So can we be able to scale up what SEWA has done for both the genders, the workers? Can we tie up with insurers? Can we tie up with major companies? They have CSR funds, which can all be kind of pooled, or they can work with the local insurers to make sure that the workers can have sometimes a choice of choosing not to go to work and still get paid in lieu of their health. Because most of the times last year, what we had in Chennai and in Madurai, where a lot of these workers had heat strokes and many of them died. 273 people died. How many of them are workers? It's like the numbers are not there, but many of them were like working outdoors, and many of them were also working indoors. So heat is not just outdoor. It's a myth. It's like indoor workers also suffer a lot. So that's one thing. The second thing is like we already have e-Shram. And that is like an insurance for domestic workers, which pays domestic workers, informal sector workers. But how much is it being communicated to these workers? Many of them don't even know. So heat has to be included as a part of that. If some worker gets a heat stroke, is the health insurance actually covering them? As of now, no. But it's just an extension of what we currently have by the Pradhan Mantri scheme. So these are all few things that can be scaled up. And the third thing that I would really say about scaling up is the preparedness of the health systems. Are we prepared if there is an adverse event that happens, or people trained to even recognize that it is an heat-related issues? This is something that I see in the field. And then I know that these are things that can be scaled up, and that those can actually protect more people in the coming years. Thank you.
Reflection on what you said is we struggle to think about what to do with workers, how to protect them in the afternoon, change work times as well. Just sort of scanning the room and looking at the average age here, in the lifetime of most folks in this room, it was perfectly normal for work to shut down in the afternoons. Shops shut down at 12:01, they reopened at 4 and 5, right? And the economic arrangements currently sort of don't permit that. And so what are the conversations we should be having about what it means to sort of work in these extreme conditions, when the privilege have always had the privilege of removing themselves from heat, so much so that India's capital would move to a hill station in the winter, right? And so we shouldn't sort of be limited in our imagination of, how do you optimize the condition of work such that you can perhaps ensure productivity, but with no attention to dignity at all. Rahul, may I turn to you? The question that I've probably asked you many times on campus, yes, all of what you said, of course, but how do we get there? That's not the city I look at when I look at cities in India.
Yeah. No, and I'll pick up on your point about the shops closing, the siesta, the closing in the afternoon. I just want to make 2 points. One is that, there's a fundamental, I could call it the Holy Trinity in imagining cities. We've completely lost track of it, which is the relationship between livelihoods, that is the jobs you're talking about, dwelling, you can call it housing, I'm calling it dwelling, and mobility, right? The shop house was the most efficient form. You don't have to worry about, you went down a flight of stairs, you opened your shop, you slept above, right? And that's how you could open and close your shop in the afternoon or in proximity. We've made mobility so damn elastic that a lot of the problems Reema was sort of describing, they they come from just getting to your place of work, for example, right? So this relationship, and in America, it's completely destroyed with suburbia and all of that, correct? So I think to go back to some of these principles in the future, amenities, of course, support it. Now, coming from that, I think what does that lead to? Which is that if you look at urban India, you look at the fact that we have a bizarre metric to measure what is defined as a town, which is 75% of the male population in non-agricultural employment, which means the entire Indo-Gangetic plain of 300 million people come in and out of cities and towns to work, etc. It's not stable. We've got to rethink what housing forms we need, for example, right? So, and I think going to imagine, so we have about 7,500 towns that are defined as towns and get a municipality and support. At least my research shows there are about 15,000 transitioning towns which have all the attributes of urban areas but are defined as villages, which are run by panchayats without any. That, I mean, how one grapples with that imaginary, because it intersects with agriculture, it intersects with what is we pose as an urban-rural binary, which has completely dissolved. And so really one has to go back and forth from the macro level to resituate where our priorities are in how we imagine urban form. Then we'll find the right solutions. Otherwise, we're going to see urban and rural India as big and small dots, which have no relationship to anything, really.
Thank you, Rahul. Reema Ben.
But you would give me the final word from our members, but I'll be happy to come in here. And I think listening to Vidhya ji and David Bhai and Rahul Bhai, I feel that what is really needed for India 2047 is a long-term climate vision, and I think which is also led by women and workers. The first plenary or opening session, which took away so much of our time, had no women on the panel, on the stage. And I think, therefore, I would really like to say that this is just a small message I'm giving to the Harvard Mittal Institute as well. Is that, you know, the long-term climate vision has to be of and by workers and also women workers. And it should also have a holistic approach. I think globally the discussions on the impact of heat or on climate, or they all are talking in silos. So you talk about heat on lives, on work, on health, but it is all happening in the silos. However, our experience of SEWA members have shown that the impact of whether it's a heat wave or a cyclone or a excessive rain, it impacts everything simultaneously: the livelihoods, health, access to food, water, energy, and therefore everything is interconnected and it exacerbates the other. So therefore, I think to need to look at these impacts and the solutions also in a holistic manner. I would also like to emphasize that there are excellent heat action plans, but they don't involve the informal sector workers, both men and women. So how do we make them more inclusive? And I think that's another aspect. So I think any action, whether on heat or on climate, has to focus on women and workers, and it must generate employment and income as well. So that's the third point. And the last point is that any action on heat must also help in organizing into their cooperatives, federations, companies, or unions, so that it becomes a longer term action plan as well. And I think the other aspect is that any action on heat is not just to reduce heat, but how does it also build resilience to other climate hazards or risks which are there and restore the nature. And we call it as building an economy of nurturance. So how do you bring in regenerative and regenerating agriculture? How do you also bring adaptation in food, and how do you strengthen your food system? And I think some of you were there. You visited the work on the ground, also met with our Agevans. And I think when I was asking our Agevans before I came here this morning, and I said, what will be your message? message to this big conference. And our Agevan said that in 2047, India has to be reorganized as a cooler of the world. What Dan Schrag was saying, that India would be getting heated very rapidly. But I think what we would really look forward to is that how we are re-recognized as the cooler of the world, as we did with the COVID crisis. And but we also, the members smiled and said, within India, cooling efforts will have to therefore take place under women's leadership. And the final message is, hum honge kamyab, we shall overcome. Thank you.
She set the stage for you, Biraj.
No, I think no one can follow. Nothing can follow what Reema Ben said so powerfully. I mean, let me talk about the opportunities. I think that one big opportunity that we have is the commitment of the political leadership in this country, as compared to, say, the United States at this point in time. We are actually run by adults. India is run by adults, and our governance, with all its warts, appears to be a paradigm of virtue compared to what's happening there. And it's not just the Prime Minister or his Council of Ministers or the political party in power, but I have seen this across India, across political parties, whether it's the states, anywhere you go, there is a deep commitment. There is a understanding that, this is a crisis, we face it, and we have to sort it. There is no climate denialism here, much in the same way that there's no anti-vax movement of any significance that we saw during COVID, except for some pockets in Nagaland or other parts in the Northeast, which had again, a bad US influence from far-right groups. So we have that, we are on the cusp of that opportunity because of the political leadership we have. In order to make it work better, I would say there are 2 or 3 things that we need to fix urgently. And since there are a lot of people from government here, as well as scientists, I think we need to have a more honest relationship with data and research. We have to move to an environment where, as India, particularly the Indian state, has to say that, look, fixing a problem will happen if we don't go about trying to fix the data, but if we try to change the reality. So you're not going to solve anemia in women by asking that question in the National Family Health Survey. You're going to change, the status of anemia by actually improving the nutritional status of women in the country. So having a less inimical relationship with facts, with research, with data, and giving scientists, researchers the space to, make data open. I think that's one big point. Second, no society, let alone India, has ever succeeded in something as major as we envisage today without the support of civil society, people's movements, and other non-governmental bodies at large. Again, I would say we are on the cusp of an opportunity, because if you look at what's happening in the US, as civic space shrinks worldwide, India has a golden opportunity to seize the value-based leadership, to allow the expansion of civic space, renegotiate the relationship that the government has had over the last 10 years with civil society, to say that, look, on food security, energy security, on national security, and indeed on climate security, every Indian backs the state. There's no question about that. Every organization backs the state. How can we come together to address this better? So increasing civic space, having a more respectful relationship with data and knowledge systems, if I may put it that way. And I think societally, we have to understand that this is not a movement for climate justice that is standalone. As a society, we have to recognize that this is a movement for social justice. As a former colleague of mine used to say, there are no human rights on a dead planet. And you're not going to address these issues if you don't have social justice. If you, as a society, are where 90% of your labor is informal, are moving deeper and deeper into a gig economy, you can't address it. Forget it. You have to fix that problem. You cannot think that you can, create structures where gig workers will have a bottle of water with a cooler where they can drink and then do that ride in 50 degrees heat and solve the problem. You have to solve the problem of the contractualization of labor, bringing more people onto the formal sector. Like any developed country, you can't have that. And I think it's not just for government to solve. I think all of us as consumers have to solve that, because we can't move towards this vision of a developed 2047 without that. I think we are on the cusp of a global opportunity to seize the space of a value-based leadership that has been abandoned by the United States and is being abandoned by large parts of the world today. The traditional post-war order which has crumbled, and it is up to our policymakers, our government, to realize that, to really carve out a global South response to the problem and take that leadership in the global South. And that, for me, would be the ideal vision for 2047.
Thank you very much, Biraj. There will be ample opportunities for us to explore each of these topics, and I won't respond further. I really wanted to thank you kindly for your very, very thoughtful remarks, for setting the tone for what we have to do over the next few days. And on behalf of the Ministry and Harvard University, I want to assure you that we saved the best for last. We have 3 extraordinary women, no men, on that panel that bring this day to a conclusion. 3 women who've given their work lives to the service of this nation. It's an honor to welcome them on stage next.
I extend my gratitude to all the panelists and moderator for such an amazing start to the first plenary. The anecdotes and the ideas were very precipient, and it was beautiful to have them as well. And we know what lies ahead for the next days.